When the world began to change forever, the Industrial Revolution did not arrive with a dramatic announcement, a single invention, or a clear beginning that people at the time could recognize as history in the making. Instead, it crept into the world quietly during the early 1700s, reshaping daily life so gradually that many living through it did not realize they were standing at the edge of the greatest transformation humanity had ever experienced. Before this revolution, the rhythm of human life had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. Most people lived in small rural communities, worked the land, and depended on muscle, human or animal, to survive. Production was slow, local, and deeply tied to nature's cycles. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, everything began to shift. In the early 18th century, Britain stood at the center of a fragile but promising balance. It was a nation rich in natural resources, especially coal and iron, with navigable rivers and expanding overseas trade routes. Its political system, though far from perfect, was more stable than many European rivals, allowing merchants and inventors to take risks without constant fear of war destroying their investments. Population growth was accelerating, creating both a larger workforce and an urgent demand for food, clothing, and tools. This pressure forced society to search for new ways to produce more, faster, cheaper, and on a scale never attempted before. For centuries, manufacturing had been done by hand. In cottages and small workshops, families spun wool into yarn, wove cloth, and crafted goods using simple tools passed down through generations. This domestic system limited how much could be produced. A skilled spinner could only spin so much thread in a day, and a weaver could only weave at the pace of their own hands. Demand began to outgrow this system, and that imbalance became the spark that ignited industrial change. One of the first cracks in the old world appeared in the textile industry. Clothing was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and as populations grew, so did the need for fabric. Inventors began experimenting with machines that could speed up production. In 1733, John Kay invented the flying shuttle, a device that allowed a single weaver to produce cloth much faster than before. What seemed like a simple improvement sent shockwaves through the industry. Weaving suddenly outpaced spinning, creating a shortage of thread. This imbalance pushed inventors to mechanize spinning itself, setting off a chain reaction of innovation. The spinning jenny, developed by James Hargreaves in the 1760s, allowed one worker to spin multiple spools of thread at once. Soon after, Richard Arkwright's water frame used water power to drive spinning machines, making production faster, stronger, and more consistent. These machines were too large and expensive for cottages, forcing production to move into centralized buildings, factories. This single shift quietly destroyed the old domestic system and gave birth to a completely new way of working. Factories were not just buildings, they were symbols of a new social order. Workers no longer controlled their pace or schedule. Instead, they followed the relentless rhythm of machines. Time itself changed meaning. The rising sun no longer dictated the start of work, factory bells did. For the first time in history, human labor was disciplined by mechanical precision. This transformation altered not only how people worked, but how they understood their own lives. At the heart of this revolution was energy. Traditional societies depended on muscle, wind, and water. These sources were limited and unreliable. The true breakthrough came with the harnessing of steam power. Early steam engines existed before the Industrial Revolution, but they were inefficient and impractical. That changed when James Watt dramatically improved the steam engine in the late 1700s. His innovations allowed steam power to be used not just to pump water out of mines, but to drive machinery, locomotion, and eventually entire industrial cities. Coal became the lifeblood of this new age. Britain's vast coal reserves fueled steam engines, heated iron furnaces, and powered factories day and night. Iron production surged as new techniques, such as using coke instead of charcoal, made it cheaper and stronger. Iron rails, iron bridges, and iron machines reshaped landscapes. What stone and wood had once built, iron now replaced, stronger, faster, and on a massive scale. As industries expanded, cities began to swell. Rural workers, displaced by agricultural improvements and lured by factory wages, flooded into urban centers. Towns like Manchester transformed almost overnight from small market settlements into industrial giants. But this growth came at a terrifying cost. Housing was overcrowded, Sanitation was almost non-existent, and pollution darkened the skies. Rivers became industrial sewers. Air thick with coal smoke choked the lungs of children and adults alike. For the first time, poverty was no longer hidden in distant villages, it was concentrated, visible, and inescapable. Factory workers labored for 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, often in dangerous conditions. Men, women, and even young children worked side by side among whirring machines that showed no mercy for mistakes. Injuries were common. Deaths were accepted as the price of progress. The Industrial Revolution promised opportunity, but it delivered suffering alongside it. Yet, despite the brutality, people kept coming. Why? Because even the harshest factory wage was often better than starvation in the countryside. This cruel choice defined the era: endure exploitation or face hunger. The Industrial Revolution did not ask for permission, it forced adaptation. Meanwhile, wealth accumulated at unprecedented levels, but only for a few. Factory owners, merchants, and industrialists amassed fortunes that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. A new class emerged: the industrial bourgeoisie, powerful not because of noble birth, but because they controlled machines, capital, and production. This marked the beginning of modern capitalism, where profit, efficiency, and expansion became the driving forces of society. The 1700s Industrial Revolution was not just an economic shift, it was a psychological one. People began to see the world as something that could be engineered, optimized, and controlled. Nature was no longer a force to adapt to, but a resource to be exploited. This mindset would shape the modern world in ways both brilliant and catastrophic. By the end of the 18th century, it was clear that humanity had crossed a point of no return. The old agrarian world was fading, and a new industrial civilization was rising, loud, fast, unequal, and unstoppable. The machines had begun to rule time, labor, and destiny itself. And this was only the beginning. The human cost of progress. By the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution was no longer a quiet transformation happening behind factory walls. It had become impossible to ignore. Cities expanded at a speed the human mind was not prepared to comprehend, swallowing villages, fields, and rivers in a matter of years. What had once been open countryside turned into dense clusters of brick buildings, narrow streets, and endless chimneys spewing black smoke into the sky. The promise of industrial work pulled people in by the thousands, but what awaited them was not prosperity, it was survival under relentless pressure. Industrial cities were built for machines, not for humans. Housing sprang up rapidly and cheaply, often constructed by factory owners who saw workers not as people but as replaceable parts of a production system. Families were crammed into single rooms with no ventilation, no clean water, and no sanitation. Disease spread with terrifying efficiency. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox thrived in these environments, cutting lives short and turning childhood into a brief and fragile phase of existence. Death became ordinary, funerals were frequent, grief was constant, work inside the factories was brutal and unforgiving. Machines dictated the pace, and humans were expected to match it. A single moment of distraction could result in crushed limbs, scalped heads, or death. Safety regulations did not exist. If a worker was injured, they were simply dismissed and replaced. There was always someone desperate enough to take their place. Wages were barely enough to survive, yet workers had no bargaining power. Employers controlled not only income, but housing, food access, and sometimes even local law enforcement. Perhaps the darkest stain on the Industrial Revolution was child labor. Children as young as 5 were sent into factories and mines, not because parents were cruel, but because poverty left no alternative. Their small bodies were considered ideal for crawling beneath machines, cleaning moving parts, or hauling coal through narrow mine shafts. They worked the same hours as adults, often longer, and suffered permanent injuries, stunted growth, and psychological trauma. Education became a luxury few could afford. For millions of children, childhood ended the moment they entered a factory gate. Women also bore a heavy burden. While industrialization offered some women wages and independence for the first time, it did so at a terrible price. Women were paid less than men for the same work and were expected to maintain households after exhausting shifts. Pregnancy offered no protection. Mothers worked until childbirth and returned soon after, sometimes bringing infants into factories where the air itself was poisonous. Gender inequality was not created by the Industrial Revolution, but it was brutally amplified by it. As suffering intensified, resentment grew. Workers began to realize that the machines they were forced to serve were also the tools that had stolen their livelihoods, dignity, and autonomy. This anger erupted in the form of resistance movements. One of the most famous was the Luddite movement, where skilled workers destroyed industrial machines they believed were responsible for unemployment and wage collapse. Contrary to popular belief, Luddites were not anti-technology, they were anti-exploitation. They were protesting a system that used innovation to enrich a few while crushing many. The response from authorities was swift and violent. Machine breaking was declared a capital crime. Soldiers were deployed to protect factories. Protesters were imprisoned, transported, or executed. The state made it clear: industrial progress would not be slowed by human suffering. Order and profit came first. Yet resistance did not disappear, it evolved. Workers began forming early labor organizations, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair wages. These movements were fragile, often illegal, and brutally suppressed, but they planted the seeds of modern labor rights. For the first time in history, large groups of ordinary people began to challenge the idea that suffering was a necessary price for economic growth. At the same time, industrialization reshaped social classes in irreversible ways. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. Wealth was no longer tied to land ownership, but to capital, machinery, and factories. A new elite emerged: industrialists who wielded enormous economic and political influence. Their mansions stood in stark contrast to the slums that surrounded their factories, creating a visual symbol of inequality that could not be ignored. This inequality sparked intense intellectual debate. Philosophers, economists, and social critics began questioning whether unchecked industrial capitalism was sustainable or moral. Thinkers like Adam Smith praised efficiency and productivity, while others warned that treating humans as tools would ultimately destabilize society. These debates laid the foundation for socialism, labor reform, and modern political ideology. Meanwhile, the environment paid a silent price. Forests were cleared, rivers polluted, and landscapes permanently altered. Cities darkened under constant coal smoke, creating conditions so toxic that sunlight struggled to reach the streets below. Nature became collateral damage in humanity's pursuit of progress. The idea that industrial growth might have consequences beyond immediate profit was barely considered. Despite all this suffering, the Industrial Revolution continued to accelerate. Why? Because it worked. Production soared. Goods became cheaper and more widely available. Trade expanded across continents. Nations that industrialized gained military and economic dominance, pressuring others to follow or fall behind. Industrialization became not just an economic choice, but a geopolitical necessity. By the end of the 1700s, society stood divided between two realities. On one side, unprecedented technological advancement and wealth. On the other, mass exploitation, inequality, and human misery. The Industrial Revolution was proving that progress was not neutral, it had winners and losers, and the cost was paid in blood, sweat, and broken lives. And yet, change was coming. Because the very forces that caused this suffering would soon ignite reform, revolution, and a complete reimagining of what society could become. The world that machines built. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. What began as a series of mechanical improvements in British workshops had grown into a global force capable of reshaping nations, empires, and the very definition of human life. The suffering, inequality, and chaos of early industrialization could no longer be ignored. Pressure mounted from workers, reformers, religious leaders, and even some factory owners who began to realize that a society built entirely on exploitation was not only immoral, but unstable. The first cracks in industrial cruelty appeared through reform. Governments, previously reluctant to interfere in economic affairs, were forced to act as unrest intensified. Riots, strikes, and public outrage exposed conditions that could no longer be hidden. Slowly and imperfectly, laws emerged to regulate factory work. Child labor restrictions were introduced. Working hours were reduced, though still harsh by modern standards. Inspections were established, and basic safety measures began to appear. These reforms did not end suffering, but they marked a crucial shift. For the first time, industrial progress was being challenged by the idea that human life had value beyond productivity. Education became one of the most transformative responses to industrialization. Reformers argued that a skilled, educated workforce was essential for long-term progress. Schools slowly expanded, literacy rates improved, and knowledge began to spread beyond elite circles. This intellectual awakening empowered workers to organize, communicate, and demand change. Trade unions, once illegal, gradually gained recognition. Collective bargaining emerged as a weapon against unchecked corporate power. The working class, once silent and disposable, began to find its voice. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution refused to remain confined to Britain. Other nations watched closely, recognizing both the power and danger of industrialization. France, Germany, and the United States raced to adopt and adapt industrial methods. Railways stretched across continents, shrinking distances and redefining time itself. Steam-powered ships transformed global trade, allowing raw materials and manufactured goods to flow faster than ever before. The world became interconnected in ways previously unimaginable, laying the foundation for modern globalization. This expansion came with darker consequences. Industrialized nations demanded resources, coal, iron, cotton, rubber, and turned to colonies to supply them. Entire regions of Asia, Africa, and the Americas were reshaped to serve industrial economies. Traditional industries collapsed under the weight of mass-produced imports. Local cultures were disrupted. Exploitation expanded beyond factory walls, becoming global in scale. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how goods were made, it restructured power across the world. Technological acceleration became unstoppable. Steam engines led to internal combustion engines, which led to electricity, mechanization, and automation. Each innovation built upon the last, creating a chain reaction of progress that continues today. Cities evolved into industrial hubs, then financial centers, then digital capitals. What once required thousands of workers could now be done by a handful of machines. Efficiency increased, but so did displacement, raising the same fundamental question again and again: what happens to humans when machines outperform them? The psychological impact of the Industrial Revolution may be its most profound legacy. Time became segmented, measured, and monetized. Productivity became a moral virtue. Idleness became a sin. Human worth became increasingly tied to economic output. This mindset shaped modern work culture, consumerism, and even personal identity. The modern world's obsession with speed, growth, and efficiency can be traced directly back to the factories of the 1700s. Yet, the revolution also delivered undeniable benefits. Life expectancy gradually increased. Medical advancements flourished. Goods that were once luxuries became affordable necessities. Transportation connected families, ideas, and opportunities. Innovation lifted millions out of absolute poverty over time. The Industrial Revolution proved that technology could amplify human potential, if guided responsibly. And this is the paradox that defines its legacy. The Industrial Revolution was neither purely evil nor purely heroic. It was a force, powerful, indifferent, and transformative. It exposed humanity's capacity for invention and its willingness to sacrifice others in the name of progress. It created wealth and suffering, opportunity and injustice, freedom and exploitation, often simultaneously. Today, as the world stands on the edge of new revolutions driven by artificial intelligence, automation, and digital power, the lessons of the 1700s have never been more relevant. The questions remain hauntingly familiar. Who benefits from progress? Who pays the price? And how do we ensure that innovation serves humanity, rather than replaces it? The Industrial Revolution did not end in the 1700s. It never truly ended at all. It lives on in our cities, our machines, our systems, and our struggles. The world we inhabit today is the world it built, and the future we create will depend on whether we finally learn from it.